They expected interrogation, humiliation, or death. But when the American guard handed them books instead of orders, the captured Japanese women didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or pray. They were still learning not to flinch. In the first weeks after capture, the Japanese nurses and clerks moved like shadows inside the perimeter. Silent columns to the mess tent, tighter lines to the infirmary, eyes down at the gate where rifles leaned without menace. They had expected cages. They received schedules. They had prepared for humiliation. They were given rules posted in neat English and halting Japanese. Roll call at dawn, latrines here, water points there, clinic hours listed like train times. Order without hatred unsettled them more than shouting would have. The camp outside Manila had been thrown up in a hurry and then perfected by habit. Barracks of weathered pine sat in rows, straight enough to appease any quartermaster. Beyond the wire, the jungle breathed and the city's scars smoked. Inside, the Americans measured everything: calories, temperatures, distances between bunks. They did not measure fear. They did not need to. It was everywhere. It spoke in the way the women slept folded small, in the way they swallowed food as if it could vanish between bites. On the 7th morning, a truck rattled through the gate with a crate that made no military sense. No ammunition stencils, no Red Cross insignia, just faded civilian letters. Property of camp library. The guard on the running board thumped the wooden slats and grinned at no one in particular. 2 men lifted the crate to a trestle table in the shade and pried it open with a pry bar, whose scars told better stories than anyone asked it to. Books. Not manuals or pamphlets, but real books, paperbacks furred at the corners, cloth-bound volumes rubbed to the grain, school readers with the slow-fading sweetness of paste and chalk. American hands had turned these pages long before war claimed those hands for other work. A chaplain signed a receipt, the camp clerk logged a number, and the interpreter, always careful, always exact, said the sentence that cracked the surface of everything the prisoners thought they understood. These are for you. For a time, no one moved. The women stood at regulation distance, eyes traveling the titles as though the letters might bite. The interpreter added the conditions: quiet hours, return if asked, no tearing, no writing. The rules were offered as assurances that this was no trick. A sergeant, whose politeness carried the weary efficiency of someone who had learned it was faster than cruelty, lifted a small book from the crate and held it toward the nearest prisoner. She did not take it. Discipline had never prepared her hands for a gift. He lowered the book onto the table with the care given a hot cup and stepped back. The other guards practiced the same choreography of distance, present, then retreat. Eventually, a nurse in a frayed armband stepped forward, bowed reflexively to the table itself, and picked up a primer whose pictures made more sense than its words. Another woman reached for a thin novel and held it against her uniform as if confirming it had weight. That night, the barracks glowed in low lamps. The books lay open on blankets like contraband that no one would confiscate. They could not read them. Not really. They traced the alphabet the way fingers memorize prayer beads, forming sounds that tasted foreign even as whispers. When the interpreter passed through to check on fever charts and dressings, he found 3 women trading a dog-eared children's reader as if passing a secret. He resisted the urge to translate. Let the mystery work, he thought, as medicine works if the patient never learns the Latin. In the days that followed, the logic of the gift revealed itself as a kind of discipline the prisoners had never met. The Americans read as they guarded. They read while coffee steamed in tin cups and wind climbed the guy ropes. They read with the same unshowy insistence with which they tallied rations and swept the parade ground. Here, literacy was not ornament. It was infrastructure. The women understood this without vocabulary. These pages explained something the rifles had only enforced. A country that could afford to be calm. They were not grateful. Gratitude was too dangerous a word. But beneath the old reflex to distrust, something else began, a quiet, unbearable recognition that their enemy believed minds were worth occupying gently. The books did not promise pardon. They offered something harder to refuse: time to think. That was the first shock they could not file under hunger or fear. Not the blankets, not the soup. Paper. Words. A civilization confident enough to hand its prisoners imagination and expect no violence in return. They lay awake listening to the guards' bootsteps and the soft rasp of pages turning 3 bunks over, and they understood, without saying it, that a new kind of defeat had entered the camp, bound in cloth and glue. The books stayed untouched for 2 days. The women passed them on their way to meals, pretending not to look. They whispered about hidden traps, about coded insults written inside. A few swore that reading an American book would curse them, that it was a quiet way to turn them into collaborators. Better to stay ignorant than risk invisible contamination. But the camp had a way of wearing down defenses without force. By the 3rd evening, after the rains came, the books called to them, not with understanding, but with memory. The smell of old paper mixed with damp wood reminded them of classrooms long vanished, of chalk dust and laughter before the war. One woman, a nurse named Aiko, stared at a children's reader until she recognized the faint drawing of a sun. She traced it with her finger, the gesture small, private. That night, she did not sleep. The next morning, one of the American nurses, Lieutenant Morgan, caught sight of Aiko sitting cross-legged by the tent flap, holding the same book open, mouthing words she didn't know. Morgan smiled, knelt down, and without permission, pointed to a picture of a dog. "Dog," she said softly. Then she pointed to herself. "Nurse." The Japanese woman blinked, clutching the book as if it might vanish. "Nasu?" she repeated, uncertain. Morgan laughed lightly and tried again. "Nurse," she pantomimed, bandaging an arm. "You, nurse." Aiko nodded, hesitated, then returned the gesture. The communication was clumsy, childlike, but it was something more dangerous than any propaganda. Understanding. Soon, others began watching. A group gathered by the table, shy at first, then leaning forward as the American taught them words. Sun, rain, sleep. The syllables stumbled across accents and exhaustion, yet each sound landed like a small rebellion against everything they had been taught. For the first time since their capture, they were not obeying or resisting. They were learning. That night, under the flickering oil lamps, the women passed the books from hand to hand. Some laughed quietly at the strange drawings, others copied letters into the dirt floor, their fingers trembling as though writing prayers. No one ordered them to stop. When the interpreter came to check attendance, he found the barracks whispering in broken English. Book, good. Read, again. He didn't report it. For the Americans, it was nothing, a pastime for prisoners. But for the women, it was the first act of free will they had performed in years. They were no longer tools of the empire or victims of the war. They were readers, even if they could not yet read. And in that fragile, wordless peace, the silence of captivity began to sound less like defeat and more like awakening. At first, the lessons happened by accident. A guard would correct a word, a medic would translate the name of a medicine, a nurse would whisper the meaning of hungry or sleep. But soon, the language itself began to spread through the camp like a quiet contagion. The women practiced when they swept the barracks, when they washed their clothes by the fence, when the night watch walked past their tents. They learned the rhythm of English through repetition, through mimicry, through daring. Each new word felt stolen, as if lifted from the enemy's pocket. Thank you. Sorry. Morning. Some carried them like weapons, using them carefully, never sure when gratitude might turn into guilt. The first time a woman said thank you to an American soldier, The words came out broken. Sanku. The guard didn't laugh. He tipped his helmet, nodded once, and went back to his post. The moment spread through the camp faster than gossip. By the second week, their Japanese ceased to sound like orders and started to sound like memory. The language of home had been the language of the emperor, of duty, of surrender and suicide. English, clumsy, foreign, fragmented, became the language of survival. It was something no one had told them they were allowed to do. Speak to live, not to die. One of the older women, a clerk named Yoshiko, took charge. Before the war, she had worked at a missionary school and still remembered her lessons. She gathered the others around at dusk, the hour when homesickness pressed hardest, and began to teach. She wrote words in the dust with a stick: water, bread, nurse, peace. The Americans walking by slowed their steps, listening to the half-sung rhythm of recitation. Sometimes the women laughed at their mistakes. Sharp, breathless laughter that startled even themselves. They laughed at their accents, their confusion, their newfound ability to say the simplest things aloud without fear. In a place built for punishment, laughter became subversion. And yet, not everyone joined. Some refused to speak, turning away from lessons. "We are not children," one hissed. "We are prisoners." To them, learning the enemy's words felt like betrayal, proof that the war had taken not only their homeland, but their identity. But even they listened in the dark, tracing the English syllables on the inside of their lips like forbidden prayers. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Yoshiko looked up from the dirt and said softly, "To read is to live again." The others nodded, unsure if they understood the grammar, but feeling the truth anyway. They had once been taught that victory was purity, and purity meant dying untainted. Now they were learning that survival came with contamination, and that maybe contamination was just another word for becoming human again. By week 4, the books no longer looked foreign. Their corners were bent, their spines soft from use. Some had tiny creases where trembling fingers had traced lines of text, trying to memorize meaning that escaped them. The women had begun trading the books like relics, whispering, "This one has a happy ending," even though none could read enough to prove it. One evening, a storm rolled in from the coast. The sky bruised purple and gray, and rain hammered the tin roofs until the camp was swallowed by noise. The women huddled together, the guards retreating to their posts under makeshift tarps. Lightning flickered through the slits in the barracks, throwing flashes of faces, young, tired, alive. A nurse named Emmy clutched one of the books against her chest, shielding it as if it were alive. When the water began to leak through the roof, she tore a strip from her blanket and wrapped the book tightly. It wasn't devotion to literature. It was protection of something that symbolized care. For years, everything soft in her world had been taken. The book was proof that gentleness could survive even here. When the rain stopped, the camp smelled wet wood and smoke. The Americans moved quietly between the barracks, checking for leaks, offering dry blankets. One of them, Corporal Davis, barely 20, freckles across his face like dust, noticed the wrapped bundle in Emmy's arms. "What's that?" he asked through the interpreter. She hesitated. "Book," she whispered, the word coming out soft and uneven. "Good." He smiled, unsure what else to do, and nodded. Then, to her surprise, he took a book from his pocket, an English Bible, its pages yellowed from the tropics, and handed it to her. "For you," he said. The interpreter hesitated, unsure how to translate "for you" in a way that didn't sound like ownership. He settled for, he says, "It is kindness." The other women watched silently. Emmy held the Bible as though it were a fragile animal. She could not read a word of it, but she turned the pages slowly, her fingers trembling as if they might burn her. On one of the first pages was a handwritten note in English. "Come back safe." That night, she didn't sleep. She read the letters aloud, one by one, the way she had heard them pronounced. Come, back, safe. It sounded like a spell, not a message. Days later, she began writing them into the dirt with her finger, again and again, until even the guards could recognize the shape of the words. Some other women copied her. They didn't know what the phrase meant, but they whispered it during roll call, before meals, before sleep. Come back safe. The phrase passed through the camp like a prayer, one without gods, one that belonged to no side. The Americans didn't correct them. Some even whispered it back. And in that exchange, wordless, uneven, fragile, the women began to realize something devastating. The enemy they'd been taught to hate had given them the one thing their own country never had: permission to hope. When the next shipment of books arrived, the women no longer treated them as foreign gifts. They treated them as bridges, thin, fragile, made of paper. But bridges, nonetheless. The camp had settled into a strange rhythm, half prison, half classroom. Each morning the women lined up for roll call, their uniforms faded, their faces thinner but calmer. After breakfast, the guards allowed them to gather near the shade of the banyan trees, where the air was cooler and the ground firm enough to write on. There, Yoshiko's school began. It started unofficially, just her and a few curious faces, but by the end of the month, nearly every woman in the barracks came to listen. She drew letters in the dirt with a stick, A, B, C, and pronounced each one slowly, like a hymn. The others repeated after her, soft at first, then louder, until the sound rolled across the camp like a tide. The guards didn't stop them. Some even watched, leaning on their rifles, pretending not to be moved. Lieutenant Morgan occasionally sat nearby with a small notebook, sketching the scene. Japanese women in ragged uniforms, learning the alphabet under palm trees in a camp built for war. For the prisoners, this was rebellion in its purest form. They had been told all their lives that learning belonged to men, that discipline meant silence, that obedience was the highest virtue. But here, under enemy supervision, they discovered another kind of power, the power of asking questions. "Why do enemies give books?" a woman asked in broken English one afternoon. Morgan looked up, surprised by the directness. "Because everyone should read," she said. Then, after a pause, "Books make peace easier." The interpreter hesitated before translating, as if the words might be too heavy. When he did, Yoshiko smiled faintly. "Peace," she repeated. "Easier." She didn't say it out loud, but she knew nothing about peace was ever easy. Some women began writing their names in English. Others learned to recognize words printed on the spines of the books: hope, faith, dreams, love. The irony didn't escape them. Words they had once mocked as Western sentimentality now lived on their tongues like forbidden sweets. But change brought guilt with it. At night, some of them cried quietly, whispering apologies to the emperor, to their families, to the dead who had chosen honor over surrender. They couldn't explain the unease that learning English gave them. It felt like treason disguised as enlightenment. Still, they returned to class each morning. The act of reading, even clumsily, had begun to untangle the fear that had once defined them. They could no longer see the Americans as monsters, and that realization cut deeper than any insult could. War had turned them into victims. Books were turning them back into people. And for the first time, when the guards passed, the women didn't look away. They met their eyes. Not with defiance, but understanding. The kind of understanding that made both sides afraid. For it meant that hatred was no longer absolute. It could be unlearned. By the time spring heat settled over the camp, the books had become more than objects. They were companions, fragile bridges between two worlds that had been taught to despise each other. The women began trading them like currency, whispering, "You finish this. What happened next?" as if each page contained a secret that could save them. The Americans, amused but quietly proud, started leaving more books where the women could find them. Not official donations, just small gestures. A dog-eared copy of Gone with the Wind, a worn Bible with half the Psalms missing, a children's grammar reader with the cover torn off. They weren't gifts, exactly. They were tests, silent questions about what kind of understanding could grow in captivity. One book in particular circulated until the spine broke, Little Women. None of the Japanese nurses had heard of it, but they connected instantly with the story. 4 sisters, bound by hardship, longing for a better world. Yoshiko read it aloud at night, her accent thick but her emotion unguarded. When she came to Beth's death, she faltered. She dies, but she is kind. The others remained silent, feeling a strange grief that had nothing to do with the war. It was the first time in years they had cried over something that wasn't lost. Lieutenant Morgan noticed the change too. During her patrols, she'd see women copying words from the books onto scraps of paper, phrases they didn't yet understand but wanted to remember. Freedom, kindness, future. She caught one of them tracing the word love with a trembling finger, then clutching the page to her chest. It unsettled Morgan more than she expected. She had grown used to seeing fear, anger, even hatred. But hope was different. Hope had weight. Hope could survive where orders could not. When Morgan mentioned it to the camp chaplain, he said quietly, "The books are doing what bullets never could." The irony was cruel but true. The women were learning not because anyone demanded it, but because curiosity had become their rebellion. In the act of reading, they discovered the simplest, most dangerous freedom of all, the freedom to think differently. At night, when guards extinguished the lanterns, some of them would whisper English words back and forth in the dark, practicing until they fell asleep. "Thank you. Good night. I'm safe." The war that had taught them to hate was ending one syllable at a time. In one of her secret letters home, Yoshiko wrote, "They give us books. I do not know if this is kindness or punishment. To read is to remember that we are human. It hurts." It was a sentence no propaganda could have prepared her for, and it marked the beginning of something the Americans never intended. A quiet revolution of the mind, spreading page by page in a camp where defeat had once meant silence. When word came that the prisoners could finally write home, many of the women sat motionless over the blank sheets of paper. The pencils trembled in their hands, not because of fear of the guards, but because of the unbearable question of what to say. How do you tell your mom the enemy fed you? How do you explain that they gave you books? Stories that made you weep, stories that made you feel alive again. Camp officials told them to keep their letters brief, censored, practical. No politics, no criticism, no sentiment, an American sergeant reminded through a translator. But true censorship came from within. Words that once defined loyalty, honor, sacrifice, purity, now felt hollow. Yoshiko, staring at the paper, whispered, "If I write I am safe, it means I lived, and if I lived, I would have betrayed them." Some refused to write altogether. One woman tore her paper in half, saying softly, "Better they believe I died for the emperor than know I am reading American books." Others wrote carefully, choosing phrases that might soften the shame. "I am alive. I am treated fairly. There is no cruelty here." Each word felt like a confession. The letters passed through the censor's tent, were stamped, and eventually crossed the ocean toward a homeland still steeped in ruin. But when replies came months later, the silence within them was deafening. Families thanked the government for the update. No emotion, no joy, no pride. To be alive as a prisoner was to carry a stigma deeper than any wound. When repatriation officers questioned the women about their treatment, many hesitated again. They knew what the officials wanted to hear, that the Americans were monsters, that captivity had been hell. Instead, they remembered the nurses who had shared their rations, the chaplain who taught them English prayers, the books that had filled the empty nights with voices of another world. But those were truths Japan did not want, so they learned to hide them. Yoshiko folded her tattered little women inside her blanket and whispered to the interpreter, "It is not a war story. It is a life story." The interpreter nodded, pretending not to understand. At night, when she thought no one was listening, Yoshiko would open her book again, tracing the faded print with reverent fingers. It wasn't defiance. It was survival. Years later, she would say, "That book kept me alive more than rice did." But in 1946, as ships prepared to take them home, the women felt something they could not name. It wasn't guilt exactly, nor pride, but the weight of having seen kindness where there should have been none. They would step onto Japanese soil carrying not scars, but contradictions. And among the few belongings they brought back, a bar of American soap, a photograph, a single pencil stub, there were always pages, torn, smudged, and forbidden pages that told them who they had been and who they might still become. When the ships docked in Yokohama, the sky was gray, heavy with mist, as if the nation itself refused to look them in the eye. The women stepped onto the pier in borrowed American coats, their skin pale from months indoors, their hair trimmed and neat. They were healthy, too healthy. Civilians stared from afar, whispering, unsure whether to pity or despise them. Japan was no longer the empire they had left. The proud banners were gone, replaced with American trucks and foreign signs. Cities lay in ashes. The homeland they had been taught to die for now looked like a graveyard, and they, alive, fed, and clothed, felt like intruders. At the repatriation office, officials asked questions in clipped tones. "Were you mistreated? Were you coerced? Did they interrogate you?" The woman answered truthfully, "No." There was hesitation, though, not because they feared punishment, but because they feared disbelief. Their honesty sounded like betrayal. When Yoshiko said quietly, "They gave us books," the officer frowned. "Books? For what purpose?" She hesitated, seeking a safe explanation. "To teach us English." The man scribbled something in his notes and moved on without meeting her eyes. Outside, families waited in long lines to reclaim their daughters, sisters, wives. Some wept with relief. Others looked away. For many, the return of a captured woman was not a miracle. It was a humiliation. To have been taken alive meant impurity, weakness, dishonor. The empire's soldiers had died shouting the emperor's name. These women had survived speaking English words. In the small coastal town where Yoshiko's mother still lived, the reunion was quiet. Her mother bowed deeply, not out of joy, but confusion. "You look well," she said finally, her voice trembling. Too well. Yoshiko wanted to explain the hunger, the nights spent weeping into her blanket, the guilt that still gnawed at her. But how could she, when her survival itself was seen as shame? At night she unpacked the few things she had brought back. A pencil, a folded letter she never sent, a torn copy of Little Women, its pages faintly smelling of disinfectant and sea air. She hid it beneath her pillow, afraid her neighbors might see. In the month that followed, whispers followed her everywhere. The local temple refused to teach her. The war widows called her the American's nurse. When she passed through the market, old men muttered, "The ones who surrendered don't deserve to walk free." She never argued. She simply bowed quietly, as she had been taught, and went home to the tiny room where she would read by candlelight, tracing each word she had memorized during captivity. Be kind. Be brave. live. Those words had once come from the mouth of her enemy. Now they were the only truth she could bear to keep. In a country obsessed with forgetting, Yoshiko carried her memory like contraband, proof that mercy had existed, even in defeat. The Americans had sent her home with clean clothes, full stomach, and a forbidden idea that compassion could be stronger than the empire. And though no one around her wanted to hear it, she knew something irreversible had happened. Japan had surrendered to the Allies, but she, in her heart, had surrendered to humanity. Years passed before the women dared to speak. Time softened the world's anger, but not their memories. They carried them quietly, folded between the pages of their lives, as carefully as the books they once hid in their blankets. When post-war Japan began its slow recovery, the story of their captivity remained buried beneath polite silence. They had been fed, protected, educated by the enemy. It was not a story anyone wanted to hear. When researchers came decades later, asking for testimony, many refused. Some were already gone. Others simply smiled and said, "There is nothing to tell." But for those who did speak, their words circled always around the same small, unremarkable moments. Not bombs, not battles, just warmth. A soldier handing them a bowl of soup, a medic draping a blanket over their shoulders, a guard who looked away as they cried. The first time someone said, "You are safe now," "I didn't believe it," one recalled. It sounded like a lie too kind to exist. Another remembered how the Americans had given her a book to pass the time. The Red Badge of Courage, a story about a boy afraid of war. "I read it again and again," she said softly. "I thought the Americans are teaching us courage through mercy. That was more frightening than any gun." They didn't know what to do with kindness. It unsettled them more deeply than cruelty ever could. For years, they had believed that suffering proved purity, that pain sanctified duty. Yet in the calm efficiency of their captors, in the steady meals, the medical care, the absence of humiliation, they saw something that cracked the walls of everything they had been taught: strength without hatred. When the women returned home, that realization became their private burden. They could not confess it publicly, so it lived inside them, shaping the way they moved through the new Japan. Some became nurses again, treating patients with the same gentleness that once saved them. Others taught English, whispering foreign words that no longer felt foreign. But none of them ever forgot the first time mercy felt heavier than fear. Yoshiko once described it this way in her old age: "They did not conquer us by the sword, they conquered us by the blanket." To her, that blanket, the one placed over her trembling shoulders as she lay in the field hospital, was not just an object of warmth, but of unbearable truth. It revealed a power Japan's warriors had never understood, a power that didn't shout, didn't strike, didn't demand surrender, but compelled it all the same. Her tears, she said, were not gratitude. They were confused. Because mercy, when you've been raised to expect only cruelty, feels like betrayal. She died decades later with her book still on her nightstand, its pages yellowed and worn. Inside, a single note in her careful handwriting read, "They won because they were kind." And in that sentence lived the weight of everything she had carried, the lesson that destroyed an empire more completely than any bomb ever could. In the end, it was not hunger, disease, or enemy fire that broke them. It was compassion. The women who had once been willing to die for the emperor found themselves undone by gentleness that defied every expectation, every command drilled into them since childhood. They had been warned that surrender meant dishonor, that Americans would torture them, defile them, laugh at their weakness. Yet the Americans had done something infinitely more devastating. They had treated them like human beings. Years later, one of the former nurses was asked what moment she remembered most from the war. She did not mention bombings, marches, or bodies. She said, "The day I realized no one was going to hurt me." The interviewer noted how her voice trembled when she said it, not from fear, but from something that still resembled disbelief. The women's commanders had preached that victory required sacrifice, that mercy was weakness. But in those American camps, mercy became the weapon that shattered the unbreakable. The kindness of the enemy was not a comfort, it was an existential wound. Every bowl of soup, every soft word, every English lesson was a mirror held up to their indoctrination, forcing them to see how deeply they had been deceived. Some tried to fight it. They bowed lower, spoke of loyalty, and repeated the emperor's name in the dark. But the warmth of the blankets, the sound of laughter from American medics outside their tents, and the soft pages of the books they had been given refused to vanish. They could not unlearn what they had seen, that humanity existed on both sides of the wire. When Japan began rebuilding, the men wrote the history of defeat in terms of strategy, politics, and power. But for these women, defeat was written in the quiet moments, the ones where no blood was shed. A blanket laid over cold skin. A stranger said, "You are safe now." A story shared in a language they barely understood. The lessons of those moments stayed with them for life. In the post-war decades, they lived simply, quietly. They rarely spoke of the war, but their actions revealed its legacy. They treated patients with tenderness that surprised their colleagues. They forgave mistakes easily. They taught their children English words that once carried shame. And when asked about the enemy, they never used the word evil. They said they were kind. For them, that kindness was not a symbol of peace. It was proof of something deeper. Proof that everything they had believed about purity, superiority, and loyalty had been hollow. Proof that strength could exist without cruelty. Before she died, Yoshiko told a student nurse, "We were defeated long before the surrender. We just didn't know it." The student asked how. Yoshiko smiled faintly and said, "Because they showed us a world where mercy was stronger than honor. And once you see that world, you can never go back." The war had been won with weapons, but peace was won with contradiction, with the unbearable kindness of those who had no reason to be kind. The warm blankets, the soup, the books, all small gestures that together destroyed an empire's illusion of righteousness. Defeat, they learned, was not always humiliation. Sometimes it was a revelation. And in that revelation lay the quiet, enduring truth of their captivity. That the greatest victory of all was to be seen, for the first time, not as soldiers or enemies, but as human beings.